Now, you may have heard, I guess it depends on what sources you study, you may have heard people say that the Beis Hamikdash, the third Beis Hamikdash, is built. The expression is bonoi umeshuchlol lemaila, that it has already been built and calibrated and it's in perfect working order on high. So the Beis Hamikdash is, so to speak, in heaven. And then when Mashiach comes, the Beis Hamikdash will descend. I'm sure you've heard that kind of thing. People talk about it a lot, the idea of the Beis Hamikdash descending from heaven into this world. We're also taught, people will often tell you that every mitzvah that you do is a spiritual brick that forms that future Beis Hamikdash. And so when all of those bricks are assembled, the Beis Hamikdash will descend. That's on the one hand. So that paints a picture that the Beis Hamikdash is very much a spiritual entity that already exists, and it's just a matter of how it will manifest into the reality of the physical world. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, last week we spoke about the fact that we have a mitzvah to build the Beis Hamikdash. And like any other mitzvah, if for circumstantial reasons you're not able to do the mitzvah in the present time, then what you have to do is you have to learn about the mitzvah. And by learning about the mitzvah, that becomes the means by which you could fulfill the mitzvah right now. So that's why at this time of the year, when we commemorate the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, we learn about the construction of the Beis Hamikdash, because that's the point, that we're showing this is the way in which we can do the mitzvah, number one, and number two, that we're enthusiastic to do it, that we actually want to build the Beis Hamikdash. It's interesting, because there were slight differences between the design of the first and the second Beis Hamikdash. There's also a prophecy of the prophet Yecheskel where he describes a Beis Hamikdash. Some of those components were used in the design of the second Beis Hamikdash, some were not. So there's a question about the third Beis Hamikdash. Will it look like the first? Will it look like the second? Will it be a hybrid of the two? Will it look completely different? And most of the commentaries say that it will be a hybrid. It will have elements of the two preceding temples and it will have its own component as well. So therefore, when you learn about the construction of the Beis Hamikdash, the original, the second Beis Hamikdash, which is what's described, for example, in the Gemara and in the Rambam, so you're actually preparing yourself to build the Beis Hamikdash, not just learning because you need to fulfill the mitzvah and practically you can't, so therefore you have to learn about it, but you're actually learning so when Mashiach comes and we're called on to build the Beis Hamikdash, we'll know what we're doing, or at least some of us will. And if we don't know what we're doing, at least we'll know where to look to find out what we should be doing. Now that seems to indicate a bit of a contradiction, because on the one hand you're saying the Beis Hamikdash is built and it's ready on high, and when the right time comes, the Beis Hamikdash will descend. And sometimes you see these Jewish art pieces where you see this Beis Hamikdash on clouds, obviously implying this heavenly Beis Hamikdash that descends into the world, on the one hand. And yet on the other hand, we see that there's an expectation of us knowing how to build it so that we can build it. Also, when you have a look, the Rambam does something very interesting. The Rambam is very precise. If you read his 14 volumes of Mishnah Torah, everything is laid out in a very strategic way, in a very rational way. Ideas build on themselves, so he introduces principles earlier in his works, and then he expects you to understand those principles for later halachic principles. And basically, he doesn't repeat things unnecessarily, because he builds on information that he's already provided. What's interesting is that he dedicates a section to what's called Hilchos Beis HaBechira, which is the laws of how to build the Beis Hamikdash, which, as we've just discussed, that's what we're supposed to learn so that we know what to do when the time arises. And then quite a bit later, all the way at the end of the series, when he talks about Hilchos Melachim, the laws of kings, the very end of the laws of kings, the last two paragraphs are dedicated to the laws of the king that we are ultimately looking forward to, the King Mashiach. Okay, so we understand why that belongs over there. I mean, it's the laws of kings, and Mashiach is a king, so therefore it fits in the laws of kings. But what he does that's interesting is he says that one of the things that there's actually three primary things that Mashiach has to do, and he bases it a little earlier in that particular section on the fact that there are three mitzvahs the Jews were commanded to fulfill when they would come into Israel. The one mitzvah is to destroy the nation of Amalek, the arch enemy of the Jewish people. The second mitzvah is to bring the Jews into Israel. Okay, not necessarily in that order. And a final mitzvah, after those are established, so you bring the Jews in, you get rid of Amalek, you establish a king, that's what brings all the Jews together, then the last component is you build the Beis Hamikdash. So when it talks about Mashiach, Mashiach is obviously a king, so the Rambam says again, that the goal and role of what Mashiach has to fulfill is he has to gather all the Jews back into Israel. He has to rid us of the enemies of the Jewish people, most notably Amalek, which, by the way, there are certain places in the Talmud where it says Amalek is not a nation and a genealogy as much as an ideology. So whoever it is that becomes the archenemy of the Jewish people at any given time takes on the title of Amalek. And then the Rambam says again he has to build the Beis Hamikdash, which is quite interesting because the laws of building the Beis Hamikdash you would assume he's already dealt with in Hilchos Beis Bechira, where he spoke about the construction of the Beis Hamikdash. So clearly the Rambam makes it that it's part of the process of how Mashiach manifests and how Mashiach steps into his role. Now that would seem to emphasize that there's a requirement for people led by Mashiach to build the Beis Hamikdash. So which one is it? Is the Beis Hamikdash going to be a supernatural experience, that it's been constructed on a spiritual plane and then it will float down from heaven and manifest into the physical? Or is the Beis Hamikdash something that we're going to build with human investment and bricks and mortar and do whatever we got to do?
Could it be like a hybrid in a way in terms of,
Oh,
like how you see augmented reality happen and virtual reality, that it's there, but actually it's almost like a augmented frame, so to speak.
very nice. Very nice. So Larry's on the money over here. That maybe there's a hybrid, maybe there's two realities that kind of coincide. And I like your example of augmented reality. Virtual reality means that basically I'm standing in my room with the VR lens on and I'm seeing something that's not actually there. Whereas augmented reality is that I walk through an environment and I have an enhanced experience of that environment because of the augmented reality. So for example, you walk through the shops and you look at products and all the information about the product comes up, or whatever the particular version of augmented reality is. So augmented reality is more the hybrid kind of experience, and that actually is exactly what's going to happen with the Beis Hamikdash as well. Because last week we learned that the first Beis Hamikdash and the second Beis Hamikdash each had different primary components, which means that each of them had an advantage the other did not have. The advantage of the first Beis Hamikdash was the extent of this divine experience, how much Hashem was revealed. In other words, how much Hashem invested himself into the Beis Hamikdash. Whereas the second Beis Hamikdash, which lacked a lot of that divine pizzazz, it wasn't as exciting, wasn't as miraculous, it lacked those 5 key components that made the first Beis Hamikdash as special as it was. So the second Beis Hamikdash emphasized human endeavor. It was a voluntary program, it was innovated by people, it was a bottom-up kind of a project where it was difficult for them to fulfill, but eventually when they did, they built a structure that was actually larger than the original, and it lasted longer. So the first Beis Hamikdash emphasized the divine input, and the second Beis Hamikdash emphasized the human input. The goal of the third Beis Hamikdash is to harmonize the two because each has an advantage. The advantage of the divine input we learned was the magnitude of the experience, and the advantage of the human input was the fact that we take ownership and it's personal to us, and therefore it affects us in a more personal way. The third Beis Hamikdash has to have both components, which means that there are certain things that humans can achieve. For example, a physical structure, to build a physical structure, is something that any one of us can do. You follow the blueprints, you look at the book of Yechezkel, you read the Mishnah in Midos, you go through the Rambam's Hilchos Beis Bechira, and you know what you have to do. It's got to be this size, on this location, and each component has to be this large. You follow the instructions, you build the Beis Hamikdash. But when you build the Beis Hamikdash, there's absolutely no guarantee that anything will happen just because you've built the structure. In fact, we even see that first in the Mishkan, when the Jews in the desert built the Mishkan sanctuary. Moshe says, he prays, which means, as Rashi says, that Moshe's prayer was, we have done what humans can do, we followed your instructions, we put together all the pieces, we've built the structure, now we ask you, Hashem, may your divine presence invest itself in our handiwork. So we create the platform, we create the environment, and then we ask Hashem to fill that environment with the meaning and with the insight and with the awareness and with the miracles and with the experience. Likewise, when King Solomon built the first temple, he made a very elaborate prayer, and basically he asked that whenever people come to this place, they should engage with the divine presence, Hashem should answer their prayers, etc. In other words, we see as a theme that the Beis Hamikdash is always a partnership. It's a partnership of human endeavor to make the structure and divine input to transform that structure into something which is beyond what the human could achieve. In the context of the third Beis Hamikdash, what Hashem will superimpose onto our structure, the divine revelation that will be available in the third Beis Hamikdash will be infinitely superior to what was around in the first Beis Hamikdash and certainly what was around in the second Beis Hamikdash. And that's what the sages are trying to illustrate us with these different references. On the one hand, they tell us that we have to build it because the third Beis Hamikdash will be human endeavor to the extent of what human endeavor can achieve. We'll push ourselves to the absolute. And in response, there's a Beis Hamikdash that Hashem has constructed which is superior to any divine experience that has ever been had here on earth. And that's what Hashem will install into our Beis Hamikdash to lift it, just like we put in the full extent of human endeavor in constructing this Beis Hamikdash, not only the physical construction, but all of the effort through the generations which so-called put bricks into that Beis Hamikdash on high. So Hashem will put the full extent of His revelation into that physical space, and our experience of that Beis Hamikdash will be exponentially superior to any other experience in the Mishkan or even in the Beis Hamikdash that Shlomo HaMelech built. We certainly have something to look forward to. The question we have to ask ourselves next is, so what's the connection between that and gathering the Jews and getting rid of Amalek? Why is it all part of the package deal? That in order to build the Beis Hamikdash, you've got to do these things as well. So that we'll leave for tomorrow.